Welcome to Module 12, Report Output Options using Genero Report Writer 2.21. When you have finished this module, you're going to be able to modify the paper settings for a report, modify the output device settings, and modify printer settings. Let's go ahead and get started. When we talk about settings for this module, we're concentrating on how that report is output to various devices. And so what can you set? We're going to be talking about page settings, we're going to be talking about output settings, and we're going to be talking about printer settings. Now there's various places that you can set these. You can create a GRW default by going to Tools, Preferences, Report Writer, and set the default for all reports. These can be overwritten by settings that you set in the individual report design document. So when you have your 4RD file open, you can go to File, Report Properties, and you can choose to either change the page settings or change the output settings. Finally, within the BDL source, you can use reporting API functions to override any of the report design document settings. Let's look at setting both the GRW defaults and the individual report design document settings from within Studio. So if I want to set my GRW defaults, I can go to the Tools and Preferences. It'll open up my Preferences window, and under the Preferences window, I can find Report Writer. You'll see that for the Report Writer, I can set paper settings that are going to be the default across all reports. If you want to set report specifics, I can select that report, and I can go to File, Report Properties, and you can see I can set paper settings. I can also set output configuration. The paper settings are the same settings that I could have set on the GRW default. However, these are going to override anything that is set on that GRW default. If I select output configuration, I can choose for this specific report to override the default with either SVG, PDF, or image. I have some rendering options I can also select, and if I decide to select an image, I can also identify what type of image I want to create, what its resolution is going to be, and the prefix name to give the images that are created for a report. And remember that when you create images of a report, each page is saved as its own image. So this prefix identifies what will be the start of the file name, and then a numerical counter will be added on as the suffix to give each image a unique name. If you've been doing the videos throughout this course, by now you've understood that we can change output settings using the API, and you should also be familiar that we need to add these changes in between our mandatory functions. So in between our load current settings and our commit current settings, we can go ahead and add new reporting API to override the defaults that are set either at the GRW level or at the individual report level. Some of these APIs that you're familiar with, the FGL Report Select Device API allows us to specify SVG, PDF, image, or printer, and the FGL Report Select Preview identifies whether we should preview it on the screen or whether we should save it to disk. If you're using the FGL Report Load and Commit, you cannot make changes using the reporting API. The load and commit is saying you want to load the 4RP file and commit your changes all in one action. So you don't have the ability to provide APIs between the load current settings and the commit current settings. Let's examine a quick example just to show some reporting API functions that we haven't talked about yet in this course. So one of the things we can do is we can set a logical page mapping, and we can configure multi-page output. Now what this is actually doing, our logical page mapping, this takes a string and we're setting it to multi-page, which means that we can then use the configure multi-page output to format for either ISO or JIS pages. So the select logical page mapping passed in the parameter of multi-page means that we can now expect the configure multi-page output, which is going to say how we want to configure this multi-page. Under the configure multi-page output, we have to provide three things. We provide a page exponent, we provide an ISO page, and we provide a portrait parameter. Now the page exponent is telling us how many logical pages we want per a page. So in our example up here, if we're setting our page exponent equal to 2, it means we're going to have 2 times 2 logical pages per page. And so this is the number when you add exponent up to 2, so 2x. The ISO page is telling us what type of ISO page we want to set. So 3 is mapping to an ISO page of A3. And then portrait is either true or false, which means do you want it in portrait mode or do you want it in landscape mode? So without these functions, if I did my load current settings and then immediately did my commit current settings, I would expect each page to be a single page on my report. However, because I've added the select logical page mapping multi-page, I know that I want to print multiple logical pages on the physical page, and then the configure multi-page output is letting me identify how many logical page I want to be on that physical page, what that physical page is going to be, and how it's going to be oriented. Let's take a quick look at this now. I have my order list report. I'm going to go to my main module, and in my main module, we can see that I've loaded my current settings, I've passed in the report name, and I commit current settings. When I execute this, I can see that each report is taking up one page. Each page of the report is being output in one page. Let's change this so that we're using a multi-page output. Inside of my 4GL file, I'm going to go after my FGL report load current settings. I'm going to add my call. So my first call is my FGL report select logical page mapping. And I'm going to pass in multi-page. My next function then is going to be my FGL report configure multi-page output. And now I need to pass in the page exponent. I'll go ahead and enter in 2, so we know that it's going to be 2 raised to the power of 2, or it's going to be 4 pages. I can put in an ISO number. Let's say we're going to print it out on A3, so I'm going to enter in 3. And then I need to enter in whether I want it to be portrait or landscape. Let's go ahead and make this portrait, so I'm going to set this to true. You'll notice in my example, I'm not defining variables. I'm entering in the values directly. If you wanted to define variables, then populate those variables and then pass in those variables. That's just an alternate way of doing it. Let me save my changes and let me execute my report. My report executes, and now we can see it's printed out on a larger paper, and it's printed out 4 logical pages on my physical page. Now for the remainder of these slides, the goal of these slides is just to identify and make you aware of a lot of the different reporting API functions that are out there that we haven't talked about yet. We're not going to go into each function in great detail. I think that would take an inordinately large amount of time. However, I want you to be aware of where these functions are at and where you can go to find out more information about these functions. So there's a series of page functions, and this is talking about how a page is set up. You can see that we have a set page margins and we have a set paper margins, and those naturally are going to set margins. We have this configure label output versus a configure multi-page output. If you recall in module 9, we talked about creating labels, and when you configure a label output, you're giving us how many labels are going to fit on a page. You're giving us the number of rows and number of columns of labels that there are. That differs from the multi-page output. And the multi-page output, you're taking a page, you're dividing it by half, you're dividing it by half again, and you're identifying how many logical pages you want to sit on a single physical page. When we talk about the subsection called output functions, there's some output functions that you're familiar with, the FGL report select device and the FGL report select preview. Here are some other output functions that you may want to use. If you're sending items out to PDF, you can configure the PDF device. If you're sending output out to SVG, you can configure the SVG device. If you're sending it out to image, you can configure image device. If you're creating an ASCII reporting compatibility mode, there's the configure compatibility output. where you can identify alternate fonts to use. You can identify a different character page width, etc. The callback localization overrides some of the localization functions. Again, if you were going to be using any of these, I will take you to the help page in a few minutes, when I would suggest you examine the help, examine the documentation that's been written on any one of these functions in order to use them properly. The last two slides of functions are a list of functions that are provided for your printer. Now, all of these printer functions, they should be self-explanatory if you're needing to use them. And if you go to File Print on any device, it's going to bring up your dialog box. Or if you edit the default printer settings, these functions are equivalent to those settings. They just allow you to implement them using the reporting API in your 4GL file. Now, there's a long list here. I'm not going to walk through them all, but if I go to the next slide, they continue on to this next slide. And again, if you want to be using any of these to configure your printer, I would send you to the documentation where you can find out the details behind each of these printer API functions. So as I promised, I was going to give you more information about finding out more details about these reporting API functions. Well, if you want to find the source, you can go into the gredir/src/api/helpers.4tl. That's going to give you the source for these helper functions. But for more details, I would probably refer you to the documentation. Inside of our documentation, under reference, we have reporting API. And in the reporting API, you can see that there's subsections where the APIs are grouped according to what they do. So if I wanted more on the page, I would look under these page functions. If I wanted the output functions, I could look and see what output functions are available. And if I wanted printer functions, I could go and I can examine the long list of printer functions that are made available. This introduction section identifies what the function is and tells you information about that function. If you want more information about a specific function, I would click on the function name, and that takes us off to a small paragraph that describes the function, describes the parameters that are passing in, and for some functions gives you a link to what's known as the dimension resolver. The dimension resolver giving you some of the units that are being used to populate the strings that are expected for some of the parameters. I hope this module has given you some insight on the additional page functions, output functions, and printer functions that are available for you. And it's given you the tools to go out there and discover more of these for yourself to be able to use them when you need to use them. Again, the most important thing to remember is that you need to call these functions after you load the current settings and before you commit the current settings if you want to implement them within your 4GL.